At the dawn of the 19th century, in the rolling grasslands of what is now northeastern South Africa, a scattered collection of small Nguni chiefdoms lived much as they had for generations, herding cattle across contested pastureland, occasionally clashing over grazing rights, but never forming anything resembling a unified nation. And within the span of little more than a decade, one man would forge these fractured clans into one of the most formidable military powers in African history, transforming a minor chiefdom of barely a few thousand people into an empire that would come to dominate the entire region and reshape the political map of southern Africa for generations to come. This is the story of Shaka, the man history remembers as the founder and maker of the Zulu nation. Shaka was born around 1787, the son of Senzangakona, chief of the small and relatively insignificant Zulu clan, and Nandi, a woman from the neighboring Langini people. But their union was considered improper under the customs of the time, and Shaka's early childhood was marked by rejection and humiliation, as he and his mother were eventually cast out from his father's homestead and forced to seek refuge among Nandi's own relatives, who treated them with contempt as unwelcome outsiders. This early experience of exile and public shame is described by most historians as a defining wound in Shaka's formative years, one that many believe fueled the fierce determination and the deep sensitivity to insult and disrespect that would come to characterize his later rule. As a young man, Shaka eventually found his way into the military service of Dingiswayo, the powerful chief of the Mfecane people, whose growing confederation of allied clans was already beginning to reshape the balance of power across the region. And it was here, within the ranks of Dingiswayo's forces, that Shaka's extraordinary talents as a warrior and military strategist first became apparent, distinguishing himself repeatedly in battle for his physical courage, tactical intelligence, and increasingly innovative approach to warfare in an era when combat between Nguni clans typically followed a fairly ritualized, cautious pattern involving thrown spears launched from a distance, with relatively few casualties on either side. Shaka, drawing on his own combat experience, began to question this established style of fighting, and is credited by numerous historical accounts with introducing a series of transformative military reforms that would fundamentally reshape warfare across the region. He shortened the traditional long-throwing spear into a much shorter, heavier stabbing weapon known as the iklwa, designed for devastating close-quarters combat rather than being thrown and discarded from a distance. He introduced larger, heavier cowhide shields, trained to be used offensively to hook and expose an opponent's side during close combat rather than purely as passive defense. He insisted on rigorous physical conditioning for his warriors, reportedly having them march and drill barefoot across harsh, thorny terrain to toughen their feet, allowing them to discard sandals entirely and move with far greater speed and endurance across open country than any rival force. And perhaps most significantly, he developed and refined what became known as the Buffalo Horns battle formation, dividing his regiments into a strong central chest to engage the enemy head-on, while two flanking horns swept rapidly around both sides to encircle and trap the opposing force, cutting off any retreat, a tactical formation demanding exceptional discipline, coordination, and communication among his troops, achieved in part through an innovative regimental system that organized warriors by age group into standing units, fostering intense loyalty, cohesion, and esprit de corps among men who trained, lived, and fought together for years at a time. When Shaka's father Senzangakona died around 1816, Shaka, with the crucial military backing of his patron Dingiswayo, moved to claim the chieftainship of the small Zulu clan for himself, and he began immediately applying his emerging military reforms to his own, still very small, following, rapidly transforming what had been a minor and largely inconsequential chiefdom into a disciplined and increasingly feared military force. When Dingiswayo was killed in battle against a rival chief named Zwide not long afterward, Shaka moved decisively to absorb much of the now leaderless Mfecane Confederation into his own growing power base, and over the following several years, through a combination of overwhelming military conquest, strategic diplomacy, and the deliberate incorporation of defeated clans and their warriors directly into his own expanding regimental system, rather than simply destroying them outright, Shaka rapidly extended Zulu authority across an ever-widening territory, defeating rival after rival, including his father's old adversary Zwide, in a series of hard-fought campaigns that came to be remembered across the region as the Mfecane, or the Crushing, a period of immense upheaval, warfare, and mass displacement that rippled outward across huge stretches of southern Africa as defeated groups fled from Zulu expansion, in turn displacing and clashing with still other communities across the region in a widening chain reaction, whose full human cost historians continue to study and debate today. Under Shaka's leadership, the once obscure Zulu clan grew, within roughly a decade, from a following of only a few thousand people into a centralized kingdom commanding the loyalty, whether through conquest or voluntary incorporation, of hundreds of thousands of people across a substantial swath of what is now KwaZulu-Natal. Its royal homestead at KwaBulawayo becoming the political and military heart of an increasingly powerful and centralized state, governed through Shaka's personal authority, his regimental system, and an increasingly sophisticated administrative structure built to manage cattle, tribute, and military mobilization across an expanding and diverse population. Shaka's rule, by nearly every historical account, combined genuine strategic brilliance and effective governance with an increasingly harsh, unpredictable, and at times brutal exercise of personal power. Particularly as his reign wore on, oral tradition and early written accounts, including those later recorded by European traders and missionaries who encountered the Zulu Kingdom directly, describe a ruler capable of extraordinary generosity and genuine concern for his people's welfare and military success, alongside episodes of severe, sometimes seemingly arbitrary cruelty toward those he perceived as disloyal, insufficiently respectful, or simply unlucky enough to draw his suspicion, and unpredictability that, over time, appears to have generated growing unease even among those closest to him. A particularly significant turning point came in 1827, when Shaka's mother Nandi died, and the grief-stricken king, according to numerous historical accounts, imposed an extraordinarily severe period of mourning on his kingdom, reportedly including prohibitions on planting crops or consuming milk for an extended period, and the execution of individuals judged insufficiently grief-stricken. Impositions that placed severe strain on his subjects already burdened by years of continuous military campaigning and further eroded loyalty among segments of his own inner circle. It was against this backdrop of mounting internal tension that, in September of 1828, Shaka was assassinated by a group of conspirators that included his own half-brothers, Dingane and Mlangana, along with a trusted advisor named Mbopa, who together stabbed him to death near his royal homestead, bringing his remarkable and turbulent decade-long reign to a violent end. Dingane subsequently seized the Zulu throne for himself, beginning a new and equally consequential chapter in Zulu history that would soon bring the kingdom into direct and increasingly fraught contact with Boer trekkers and, later, British colonial forces expanding into the region. Despite the brevity of Shaka's actual reign, historians widely regard his impact on Southern African history as difficult to overstate. The centralized, militarized state structure he built proved durable enough to survive his own violent death, continuing under his successors Dingane and later Mpande and Setshwayo, who would go on to lead Zulu forces to their most celebrated military victory decades later at the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, a stunning defeat inflicted on invading British colonial forces that shocked the British Empire and stands, even today, as one of the most significant victories any indigenous African army ever achieved against a major European colonial power, a legacy of military discipline, tactical sophistication, and fierce national identity tracing directly back to the reforms Shaka had instituted more than 60 years earlier. Beyond the battlefield, Shaka's reign fundamentally reshaped the ethnic and political landscape of an enormous portion of southern Africa. The widespread displacement and reorganization of populations during the Mfecane period contributed directly to the later formation and consolidation of several other major regional kingdoms and identities, including the Ndebele nation under Mzilikazi, a former general of Shaka's who ultimately broke away and led his own followers northward to found a new kingdom in what is now Zimbabwe, along with significant demographic and political shifts that shaped the later trajectories of the Sotho, Swazi, and numerous other Nguni-speaking communities across the region, making Shaka's influence, whether through direct conquest, forced migration, or the diffusion of his military innovations, one of the most consequential single factors in the political reshaping of 19th-century Southern Africa as a whole. It's worth noting that Shaka's historical legacy, much like his character during his lifetime, remains genuinely contested and complex among historians today. Some scholars, drawing on colonial-era accounts written by European traders and missionaries with their own biases and agendas, have historically portrayed Shaka in starkly exaggerated terms as an uniquely bloodthirsty and irrational tyrant. framing his conquests as senseless savagery in ways that later scholarship has increasingly recognized as distorted through a colonial lens designed in part to justify European intervention and later conquest in the region. More recent historical and archaeological research, drawing more heavily on Zulu oral tradition, comparative regional evidence, and a more critical reading of the original colonial sources, has generally offered a more nuanced picture, one that recognizes both Shaka's genuine strategic and organizational brilliance as a nation-builder and military innovator, alongside the real human costs, including significant violence, displacement, and at times, brutal exercises of personal power that accompanied his rapid and unprecedented consolidation of Zulu authority. What remains beyond serious dispute, however, is the sheer scale of Shaka's transformative impact within an extraordinarily compressed span of time. In barely more than 10 years on the throne, he took a minor, largely unremarkable chiefdom of a few thousand people and forged it into the core of a powerful, centralized kingdom whose military innovations, political structures, and cultural identity would go on to shape the history of an entire region for the better part of 2 centuries, whose descendants today number in the millions across South Africa, and whose name, Zulu, once belonging to nothing more than Shaka's small and inconsequential birth clan, would come to be recognized around the world as synonymous with one of the most formidable and historically significant kingdoms Africa has ever produced. Today, Shaka's legacy is honored across South Africa through numerous memorials, including King Shaka International Airport in Durban, named directly in his memory, and he remains, to this day, a figure of enormous cultural and historical significance, celebrated in Zulu oral tradition, in South African historical scholarship, and in popular culture across the African continent and around the world as the singular, transformative figure whose military genius, political ambition, and force of personal will took a scattered handful of competing pastoral clans and, in barely a decade, forged them into a unified and enduring nation whose story continues to be told, studied, and debated nearly 2 centuries after his death, a leader remembered, above all else, as the maker of the Zulu nation itself.